We all know someone, or we've all experienced it ourselves, when we've gone through and we've done deadlifts or a hinge pattern like RDLs or even a deadlift from the floor, and we've felt that really tight, stiff pain in our lower back. Now, I want to explore what that is first and then go through some strategies to maybe counteract that for yourself. So a few things you can play with to try and get that feeling or to reduce that feeling in your back. So, hey guys, welcome to Focus Performance Training. This week I want to talk about hinging or deadlift patterns and getting a sore back at the end of it. We all know someone, or we've all experienced it ourselves, when we've gone through and we've done deadlifts or a hinge pattern like RDLs or even a deadlift from the floor, and we've felt that really tight, stiff pain in our lower back. Now I want to explore what that is first and then go through some strategies to maybe counteract that for yourself. So a few things you can play with to try and get that feeling or to reduce that feeling in your back. So that lower back pain, what's causing it? Well, when we see in our lower back, we've got the lumbar vertebrae, L1 through to L5, and then we've got the sacral vertebrae, which is a fused vertebrae, which sort of are that cornerstone in between our ilium and our sacrum or our spine. So ilium are our hip bones, and then our sacrum, and that's where you see the SI joint. So the sacroiliac joint is where the sacrum meets the ilium. Now that's important to understand because that's a big pivot point and there's a lot of load that gets transferred through that point in our body. So what can happen is that if we start to get back pain in that area or a little bit higher, it can be a combination of a few things. And this isn't an exhaustive list and there are a few other models which may need to be explored to get you the right fit, but this is what I've seen to work for myself the most. Generally what happens, or the reason why that back pain is occurring, is a result of sort of some poor execution of that movement. And what I mean by that is generally that will tend to bias or pull from our upper back first. So we'll come from that bottom position and we'll arch up first, creating a lot more extension of our spine, which will mean that spine will get jacked up, or rather the erectors and multifidi of our back, which should be working in an isometric contraction, which is they're just maintaining their length and not changing, start to act concentrically and can start to put a bit more pressure on our vertebra. And that can cause some discomfort. And when those muscles swell because they've got a big pump, that's where some of that pain may come from, it may start to compress that area a little bit more. So if that is one of the issues, now I'm not saying that is the whole issue, can be a whole host of other issues going on. There can be some diagnosis or some symptoms of bulges or some degeneration of the disc or entrapment of nerves, and that's a completely different, story or world that I won't dive down. But if you do feel like you've got referral pain down your legs, then my immediate recommendation to you is to go and see a practitioner straight away, because when I hear that, that's a red flag for myself to go, you need to go and see a physio or a doctor to try and get this looked at a little bit more closely, because it is not my role and it is no one's role as a strength and conditioning coach or a sports scientist or even a PT for that matter to diagnose you or tell you what's wrong. We can simply start to theorize and see what works and what doesn't work without trying to cause you excessive harm. So that's a big thing that we need to be aware of right there. So if the issue is that we're coming from that position here and we're arching back and we're getting a big pump and that lower back is sort of sitting into mad anterior pelvic tilt where we sit forward, then how do we fix that issue? Well, one of the big things that I look at is I think about trying to get clients to push the floor away first. So from that bottom position here, we set up in that position and we're trying to push, and we're simply just trying to squeeze our glutes through and end up in a nice strong position. We don't want to be arching back to lock it out. The reason why some people do that is because in powerlifting, you really want to make sure that your lockout is evident. You don't want to get your attempt red flagged or red lighted because you had a soft lockout and it wasn't deemed locked out. You want to make sure of it 100%. So that's why that's there. But for everyone else, we don't need to stand back and get our shoulders behind our hips like so. We can probably finish with our shoulders just forward or in line with our hips with our glutes squeezed nice and tight. So how do we do this with an RDL, which is not really using our quads as much as it would from the deadlift from the floor? Well, I've got a barbell here. So from this position with our RDL, what I want you to think about doing is pushing your hips back and driving your big toe into the ground and trying to keep that bar nice and close. You get to a point where your hamstrings will be on stretch quite significantly. From there, taking your hips forward. You'll notice that I'm not pushing them all the way through. I'm just squeezing them until they're tight in that position there. And then I'm trying to lead with my sacrum, which is that sort of bone in between my pelvis and my spine, where it's part of my spine, in between my pelvis, and then coming back through again. So the sacrum is just in here. So I'm trying to push that up towards the sky. That's going to keep my hamstrings on stretch, which will be what I'll load predominantly. And from there, I'm going to try and keep that nice and high as I come through and squeeze my glutes. And this is something like cue that I got from Tom Hayes at Perform Motion, which worked really well for myself. Another thing we can do which can help with that is adding a foam roller in. Now, I like the rumble roller for this reason because it's nice and small. I don't particularly like rolling on it because it just hurts a whole lot. But what we can do is when we go in that position, people will tend to go with the whole Kelly Starrett mobility WOD, drive your knees out as far as you can, and now you've got an unstable foot position where your toes are coming off. We want to try and keep our full foot in contact with the ground. So the foam roller in between the knees, what that will do is it'll most likely set your feet in a good position, being directly under your hips, and you'll be able to drive your feet straight into the ground nice and tight, keeping a good knee position over your toe. So from side on without the bar, we're here, pushing back, keeping our hips nice and strong in that position. That can stay high, squeezing through. And that's going to allow us as well to not just dump forward through our lower back. Because this will come back to that bracing episode that I did where we looked at if your hips aren't tucked under or at least in a neutral position, it's much harder to keep it's much harder to keep a good amount of intra-abdominal pressure in your midline. If you're dumped forward, there is not a lot of space for your diaphragm to push down into. So whereas if we come to this position here, we can actually create a lot more tension there and stay in a nice strong position. I saw a really nice sort of photo of the midline being sort of explained on Instagram where you've got sort of a cylinder here, a red cylinder, blank cylinder, and I'll try and put a photo in here somewhere when I find it, and then a red cylinder here. So we can try and keep those two cylinders aligned so we can move them in unison. That is at least for heavy bilateral movements. When we look at unilateral movements, where we're looking at using single leg work, that may change a little bit because one hip's going to be rotated forward and one will be rotated back. So another way that we can try and mitigate some lower back pain when we're going through our hinge work is we can actually set up into a hinge or a B stance position. So I'll go front leg forward. So this front leg is going to be the working leg. This rear leg is there for support, okay? So what we can do is we can hinge back and we can actually feel that a whole lot more through that leg. We can get our sternum over our knee, over our toe, into a nice strong position and then come forward. And that will actually load that glute a whole lot more and the hammy a little bit more respectively. You're not going to move as much weight with the B stance as you would with a normal RDL, but you're going to be able to move more weight than you would with a single leg RDL. That back leg just comes back and through. And that was a terrible RDL, never do them like that. So that's an option there. We can also go into a heel, like a rear foot elevated, where if we had a bench, I won't grab my bench, but I'd have my foot on a bench behind me and it's the same deal. We can shift our weight back. We can even add in a wall RDL where if I'm going to use this pole here, I've got that back foot pushed in and on the wall. So I've got some work pushing that heel, keeping that glute on there. All my weight's over my stance leg, being this leg here closest to the camera. And I can hinge over nice and strong and then snap through. So we can actually develop the hamstrings and glute sort of area or musculature a whole lot better rather than just going through an RDL with our bilateral if it's causing issues. Now, another argument that could be made for unilateral versus bilateral is something that Mike Boyle talks about, where hardly any of his athletes actually squat and deadlift bilaterally, being two legs at a time. A lot of their work is either in a split stance, so stance like this, or a B stance, which is going to mimic athletic population and athletic movements a whole lot more. Or they do it in a rear foot elevator, so split squat work, all that sort of stuff. And they're all really valid sort of tools or methods that we can use, or exercises we can use even, to actually progress our athleticism. Well, I see it, and this is sort of a changing lens for myself. There is a good argument that could be made from away from competition, off season. Yep, let's develop your bilateral strength and let's try and get you really strong bilaterally. Then as we move towards more sport-specific competition, let's transition that strength work into more unilateral work so that we can develop the qualities which we're going to be explored and put into practice, I guess, on the sporting field. Now, the argument can be made that you're not going to recruit as high motor order units during that unilateral phase, but if we look at it from what are we trying to do in that phase? Well, we're not trying to really exhibit or get any more strength. All the strength that we wanted to have achieved should have been done prior to the season. During season, for most weekend sports, you look at rugby, cricket, hockey, all your team sports that are being played on the weekend on a 7-day cycle, we're really just trying to maintain strength and maybe optimize the amount of power that we can generate from that level of strength. So this is where that argument can come into play as well. Anyway, guys, if you're having pain in your lower back, have a look at actually how you're moving up and what you're initiating, where you're initiating the pull from first. Try and think about squeezing your hamstrings and squeezing your glutes through and not leading with your shoulders to lean back, all right? That is one of the big cues that I see fix a lot of people's issues. If you've got any more questions with this, guys, hit me up, let me know. Hope everyone's doing well, keeping sane, and I'll see you later.